I didn't know.
Oops, better stop this poll then.
Yeah, there we go. We're live. And bonjour à tout le monde. Bienvenue à cette session de notre série de discussions sur the state of America. Welcome everyone to this edition of the AmCham Quebec sessions on the state of America, a regular overview of what is happening in American society, politics, and economic affairs that in the end impacts us all. Pour les gens qui ne connaissent pas la Chambre de commerce américaine au Canada, people are trying to get a hold of me here. Anyway, pour les gens qui ne connaissent pas la Chambre de commerce américaine au Canada, la section Québec, la mission de la Chambre est de promouvoir les relations économiques fructueuses entre le Canada et les États-Unis, y compris une compréhension de ce qui se passe aux États-Unis, tant sur le plan politique et social qu'économique à travers des conférences comme celle d'aujourd'hui. Nous organisons régulièrement des webinaires sur les différents aspects de faire affaire aux États-Unis. En décembre dernier, en collaboration avec le consulat des États-Unis et le Department of Commerce of the United States, nous avons organisé une conférence Select USA à Montréal où plus de 300 entreprises québécoises étaient présentes pour pouvoir rencontrer des représentants de 26 États américains sur les opportunités d'investir aux États-Unis. Avant de passer la parole à M. Raymond Bachand comme modérateur principal aujourd'hui et la présentation de nos panélistes, je veux souligner l'appui à cette conférence de Norton Rose Fulbright Canada, Bureau de Montréal et de coopération du Conseil de relations internationales de Montréal, le CORIM, et du Conseil du patronat du Québec. Thank you, Norton Rose Fulbright, CORIM, and the Conseil du patronat for supporting this endeavor. Now for our panelists, Gerald Seib, David Shribman, and Art Cullen, all three of whom are recipients of Pulitzer Prizes for journalism, very distinguished prizes in the United States. Jerry Seib is the former executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal and is currently affiliated with the journal's Center for Strategic and International Studies. As the Washington bureau chief for a number of years, he oversaw the journal's news and analysis from Washington. He appears regularly on networks such as CNBC, Fox Business Network, CNN, and the BBC as a commentator on Washington affairs. Jerry is the author of the 2020 book on the Republican Party, We Should Have Seen It Coming, From Reagan to Trump, a Front Row Seat to a Political Revolution. He was part of the team from the Journal that won the 2001 Pulitzer Prize in the breaking news category for its coverage of the September 11th terrorist attack. David Shribman. David was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1995 for his coverage of Washington and the American political scene. He has occupied the positions of executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and assistant managing editor, columnist, and Washington bureau chief of the Boston Globe. He is now the J.W. McConnell Professor of Practice at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University, teaching a course on the American presidency. A dual citizen of the United States and Canada, he served as national political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and covered Congress and national politics for the New York Times. Art Cullen. Art is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist as well. He is the editor of the Storm Lake Times Pilot, a family-run weekly newspaper in small town Iowa, and author of the 2018 book, Storm Lake, A Chronicle of Change, Resilience, and Hope from a Heartland Newspaper. Drawing from the stories of one special small town on the broken prairie, Art has strove to inspire a broader sense of dialogue, renewal, and understanding of rural places in America. His comments today will be of particular interest to people who will try to understand what is happening in small town America and why they vote for the people they vote for. And so without further ado, I turn it over to Raymond Bachand, ancien ministre des Finances du Québec, a strategic advisor for Norton Rose Fulbright here in Montreal. Raymond, c'est à vous.
Merci Tom, bonjour, bonjour à tout le monde, bonjour à tous ceux qui nous écoutent. It's a pleasure to see you all again and our new guest, Art, which is here. Our tradition is to have 3 or 4 blocks of subject which are major concern for listeners, internal American politics in Washington, major international issues, economic issues, and then if we have time, advice for Canadians and impact on Canada of all of this. And feel free to ask questions. Tom will be looking at them and we'll throw in your questions towards the end of the seminar. So, American politics, 2024 landscape leading to November, from the primaries to the presidential campaign, the senatorial and congressional elections. What's going on? What will Super Tuesday look like? What will these elections be about? And basically what's going on right now. David, do you want to start on that?
Well, we have a situation now where we have been through the Iowa caucuses that Art viewed at firsthand in the New Hampshire primary where I was. And we have pretty much a presumptive Republican nominee, Donald Trump, and a presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. They're very pleased to be in the position they're in, but no one else in the country is too pleased about this at all. All the polls show that the public would like almost anything besides a rematch of the 2020 election. We haven't had a rematch, I don't think, since 1956 with Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower. The country was much more congenial to that than they are today. The situation really boils down to one question: will Donald Trump return as president? I think it's been Donald Trump's fondest hope since he was a young man to be the most important person on earth. He has achieved that, much to the distress of his rivals, but I think it's incontrovertible that he's the most important person on the face of the earth, and certainly the most important figure, even more so, I think, than the president in American politics right now, because all of American politics right now revolves around the question about will there be a second Trump term. So I think that's about as succinctly a summary as I can provide, Raymond, and we'll go next to Jerry and to Art.
Okay.
Well, certainly, I think David summed it up well. We're at the very beginning of an election year, but it feels as if we're halfway through it already because the calendar is moving so quickly. And, it was set up this way. The Republicans, at the behest of Donald Trump, set up a system that is designed to allow him to wrap up the nomination quickly and easily, both because of the calendar and the rules of the primaries. The reality is that seems to be happening in even more rapid fashion than anybody would have guessed. There had been this thinking that if the Republicans in 2016 had just gotten the race down to a two-person contest between Trump and anybody else, the anybody else could have won. So here we are, and that's what's happened in 2024, which is the race is a two-person race between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina and former UN ambassador. But it doesn't look as if that's going to be enough to stop Trump, even if you consolidate the anti-Trump vote. That's not a certainty. I mean, weird things happen in American politics. We've all learned to be modest in our predictions over the last 7 or 8 years, and I certainly have. But it is kind of hard to see how Nikki Haley can overcome this reality of Donald Trump. The Democrats have long thought that the easiest person for Joe Biden to beat was in fact Donald Trump, because he's so flawed, carries so much baggage, and energizes a Democratic base in a way that even Joe Biden can't on his own. Now they're facing the question of, well, is that really true? Is that the way this is going to work out? I would just make 3 quick final points. One is that it looks very grim for President Biden right now. His job approval is at a historic low. It's in the 40% range. But as somebody reminded me yesterday, we're now in an age of so much cynicism and disillusionment that nobody has much public approval. So 40% approval is the new 50% approval. So maybe it's not as bad as he thinks. Secondly, the economy is getting better, and it takes a while for voters to believe that things are better, even after they have become better. The fact that it's going to take a while is okay for Joe Biden because he has 10 months to convince people the economy is getting better, and it takes about that long for people to become convinced. So that's a distinct possibility. The third part of the silver lining for Biden, I think, is that while most Republicans act as if they don't care if Donald Trump is convicted of a felony sometime in the next 6 or 7 months, the reality is that there's a segment of even Trump supporters, our polling suggests 7 to 10%, who are going to rethink their support of him if that's really what happens as the year unfolds. Doesn't sound like much, but in a race in which everything's decided on the margins, a movement of that many voters really matters and could in fact be decisive.
So there could be a slight erosion with moderate Republicans and independents that could be leaning Republicans. Whatever happens to Trump in all the court cases, is it only if he's convicted criminally or if he loses all these other cases?
I think the big one is he convicted criminally? Does he actually literally become a felon who's trying to become president of the United States? Up until now, the fact that he has been subjected to this, to these cases, to the prosecutions and the civil cases, has worked his benefit, you have to admit, because he basically uses it as a sign that he's persecuted by them, and he runs against them, and his people, his supporters, are suspicious of them, which means everybody outside of us, and it means the establishment and anybody in authority. But at some point, maybe that turns. Maybe it's no longer a badge of honor, but a real concern to real voters. That happens when it's not an abstract idea, but a real reality.
Art?
Well, thanks. My predecessors know a lot more about the national scene than I do. So I can talk a little bit about what I saw during the Iowa caucuses. And the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary are the first nominating events of the presidential cycle in the United States. And the Iowa caucuses took place in January, and then New Hampshire follows a week later. And Iowa's cycle is about 2 years out, actually. You'll start seeing candidates come in as soon as the last election is over nearly. And but it seemed from the very beginning that Ron DeSantis was going to be the challenger to Trump. But it became apparent very rapidly in Iowa that Trump faced no real opposition, and early polling suggested it. And then if you just talk to people, the Republican Party was completely in the tank for Donald Trump, and it showed in Iowa, and it was a surprise to nobody. And the reasons for that are pretty complicated, but the rural Midwest, it certainly feels, will go for Trump bigly again in the next election. I think Iowa will, because for one thing, Democrats have largely written off a lot of these rural states as unwinnable, and so they'll just fly over. And second, there's a real appeal for Donald Trump in these rural America, all over the country, because of this deep and long resentment that's built up over really about the last 40 to 50 years of decline in rural America. And that explains a lot of it. We're written off oftentimes as racist or xenophobic hicks, but the story is a lot more complicated than that.
Okay, thanks. So basically, the candidates are settled. We'll go to the issues of the electoral campaign in a few seconds. But I got one question. Why is Nikki Haley hanging in? And if she continues getting 30, 40%, and then Super Tuesday and things like that, is there a strategy where she would continue hanging in case something happens? Is that and if something happens, and let's say Trump had a stroke and disappeared, is it Nikki, or everything is open once again? David?
I think she's staying in part with a very faint hope that she might prevail in a couple of places on Super Tuesday, Vermont, Massachusetts, maybe Michigan, I don't know. that she might continue to get a couple of delegates from each of those places. Some of them are winner excuse me, winner take all. That she gets more votes in today's meaningless Nevada primary than Trump gets in the fully meaningful caucuses 2 days later. And that if something happens to Trump, she's the instant front runner, and she has some convention delegates to prove it. Otherwise, I think she feels, or increasingly feels, and her supporters and funders surely feel, that the more you can irritate Donald Trump, the more you can make him do or say something unseemly, if not outright offensive and malignant, the better it is for the country, and that he'll be diminished even further. So I think she's playing both a ideological and irritating role, and that she's pretty good at both of them.
And
Jerry?
I would just add that I think, I don't know, I'm not sure she knows what the strategy is. I think a lot of this is just hoping lightning strikes, but I kind of think she crossed a Rubicon in New Hampshire, in which she had spent a year trying to be a little critical of Donald Trump, but not really critical of Donald Trump, not wanting to offend anybody who likes him. So trying to figure out if there was a way to kind of be sort of for Trump, but not exactly for Trump. And I think she's now thrown that overboard. She crossed over to the, well, I'm just going to be full bore, the anti-Trump candidate. I'm going to say what I really think, which is that he's a bore, he's dangerous, he's out of control, he's a producer of chaos. So having crossed over to that point, there's no reason to go back. Donald Trump is not going to pick her to be his running mate after all this. He never was going to anyway. She's not going to be in the cabinet. She's moved into the anti-Trump position. So once you're there, you might as well stay there and see what happens. And David mentioned an interesting thing, which is there are, and again, we're talking about slim possibilities here, but there are a bunch of primaries coming up in which both independents can vote in the Republican primary. That benefits her. It means some people can move in and vote for her. And the rules were written, and ironically written this way by the Trump people by and large, so that they're winner take all. If you win 50.1% of the vote, you get all the delegates of that state. Well, if she can eke over 50% in one of those states, the tables turn on Trump and she gets the delegates. So all of a sudden, maybe it looks like she's viable. Again, we're dreaming here a little bit, but those are possibilities. It's not beyond the imagination of man to see that. So why not stay in for a while and see what happens? As I said, you've already crossed over and you've burned your bridges with Trump anyway.
And she has nothing else to do this spring, so what the heck?
Yeah, true. And she's raising a lot of money to do it. So she's not facing.
He's basically just waiting for Trump to choke on a cheeseburger.
Yeah,
Exactly. Art says what
if I ask a question here, the Canadians up here are just have difficulty understanding, why Trump is ahead in the polls, and how do you explain the Trump strength when Democrats and independents together so outnumber Republicans in terms of voter registration or not? And how do you explain that? Are the American people paying attention to what Trump is doing or has done? It's surprising to Canadians that he's maintained such popularity across the board.
Well, you have to remember a lot of people like what he's done. I mean, you probably, all of us are horrified by it to some degree or another. A lot of Americans like it. They like it because, they want somebody, and Art referred to the disillusionment over the kind of the sliding value of lifestyle of a lot of Americans. They want to blame that on somebody. Trump gives them somebody to blame it on. It's them. They're doing it to you. The elites are doing it to you. He's tapped into that sentiment, and those people don't like what Trump does or how he acts, but they like what he stands for. He stands for a willingness to bust up the system, whatever that means, and he stands for a willingness to try to wrest back control from elites, the woke culture, which people are repelled by and sometimes scared by. And I would just have to add to the mix, and we can't dance around this. Joe Biden's old, and people think he's old. He looks old, and they're scared by the fact he's so old. And so there's a kind of a, well, which is the lesser of two evils here? And that clearly benefits Trump at the moment.
At the end of the day, in October, November, is it going to be between Biden's old age and Trump's mental stability?
Yep.
Kind of begs the question of what the election is really going to be fought over.
And that comes
The
to
border, the war, whatever.
what's the
border, the war, and Kamala Harris.
is Congress going to be unmanageable for the next 8 months, like it's looking at, so that major policies cannot be adopted?
Absolutely. There's just no question that Congress has paralyzed. The border compromise in the Senate. The U.S. Senate agreed to a fairly conservative set of rules governing the border, and especially asylum, tightening up on asylum. And you know, that's people are going to the wall over that, and the wall, and so that's absolutely where it's boiling down.
So maybe we'll come back to the election issues, but on international politics, basically, from a Canadian point of view, whatever the squabbles in the States, whatever people hate each other, when it comes to major war issues, security, international security and peace, there's always been in the past a coalition of interest between Republicans and Democrats. So how do you see these playing out? Because these are major issues for the world in the next few months and for business community. And we could take them one by one, you know, Russia and the Ukraine invasion. Divisiveness, or the Congress will get together on that?
Well, I'll answer that. Let me start though with a broader point, which is that both parties have moved away from internationalism. The Republicans are at a crossroads. They're at an inflection point. They are having to decide for the first time since 1952, when Eisenhower took control of the party, whether this is an internationalist party or an isolationist party. And Trump clearly wants to push them down the isolationist path. There's a decision to be made here by Republicans, and it affects Ukraine, it affects the way we deal with China and Taiwan, and it certainly affects even the way the U.S. will, in the long run, support Israel, which most Republicans want to do. Democrats have also moved away from internationalism. The whole global economy helps us all is now not embraced by the left wing of the party. The left wing of the party is not still supports Ukraine, but is certainly not supportive of the current Israeli government. They just as soon pull back. And so this kind of big, broad coalition in the middle that supported American internationalism has eroded from both sides. So that's the backdrop. There's still a majority of support in Congress for helping Ukraine. The question is, and this goes to Art's point, in a dysfunctional Congress in which a right-wing Republican minority can block things from happening in the House, can you get there? Not clear. There's clearly a majority in Congress to want to support Israel. That'll probably happen one way or the other. But there's a significant amount of the Democratic Party doesn't want to go there either, because they're so repelled by Netanyahu and what the Israeli government stands for in terms of how they handle Palestinians in occupied territories.
So we're going back to
a lot of common folk,
a
a lot of common folk, left or right, think that that honestly that they've been fighting over that for 2,000 years, and why are we fueling that? And I hear that all the time from just common people. And second, why isn't Europe bucking up and doing their fair share, as Trump might suggest, in Ukraine? And if you talk
I would add, why isn't Canada bucking up and paying its full share?
Yeah, if you talk to average people, that's exactly where they're coming down.
You know, and the irony in that is that Europeans have done a lot in the last 3 or 4 months to step up on Ukraine, but in a way it's too late, because Americans have average Americans, I think, have absorbed the notion that the Europeans are freeloading and we're doing all the heavy lifting in Ukraine, and that's not right. Actually, not true right now, but it's, as I said, it's perception, not reality.
Prime Minister Trudeau has said that Canada will never reach the 2.1% that NATO requires, and that you just forget it. So
For defense spending.
So for those old enough, we're going back to the 20th century where America stood aside the two large wars and got involved at the end because then their own security was really at risk. Of course, Pearl Harbor the last time. So what happens with Iran and everything that's going on? Because Iran is attacking the United States through proxies all over the place. And that's a very dangerous situation. How is that handled by the Washington and the parties and the American public?
I think Jerry's the expert on Iran here.
Well, look, I think the reality is that Americans hate Iran. They want to do something there. They want to create a regime change, but they're not willing to pay the price necessary to do that. So I think, and while people recognize that Iran wants to basically become the regional power that controls events in the Middle East, and they're not happy about it, I don't think they're prepared to do what you need to do to stop that from happening. And the reality is that a lot, and this goes to something Art, I think, was referring to. There are a lot of Americans who think that we're tangled up with Iran because we got involved in two forever wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, that didn't go well, that bled us for 20 years. And if we would just stop doing that, other people, the Middle East could sort out its own problems. So we hate Iran. We know what the Iranians are up to, but we're not willing to stand up to them. Let's just come home. And if Donald Trump wins, that's what's going to happen. You will see a retreat from the Middle East, I predict, by the U.S. He'll be willing to, pop off against Iran if they interfere with shipping of oil through the Straits of Hormuz. But he's just going to back away, and I think that's a lot of the American sentiment, and that's what Joe Biden is kind of fighting. People see the fact there are American troops on the ground in Syria and in Iraq and in Jordan. They can't figure out why that's the case, and the Iranians are pushing against what may turn out to be an open door when they try to get the U.S. to exit.
But Jerry, let me ask you a question. Isn't it so that that President Trump, who was the one who moved the embassy to Jerusalem, is more pro-Israel than, in some ways, Joe Biden, and that the evangelicals, who are a major element of his base, are so pro-Israel that some ministers, government ministers in Israel, believe that evangelicals are more pro-Israel than are American Jews. So how can he really back away from that?
Well, but see, David, this is the insanity of what's happening on the left right now, on the Democratic left, which is they're and particularly in Michigan, which is the biggest center of Arab Americans in the country, traditional Democratic voters. They're outraged because Joe Biden is supporting Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu so assiduously. So they're going to do what? They're going to vote for Donald Trump, who, as you said, is basically did whatever, gave the Israelis a blank check, or they're going to stay home, which is the moral equivalent of casting a vote by default for Donald Trump. It doesn't make any sense, but that's and some of those people maybe will go vote for Robert Kennedy or a third-party candidate, Cornel West, which is a protest vote, but it also amounts to a vote for Donald Trump. So what's the alternative in their minds? It doesn't make sense, but we've leapt beyond logic here to a certain extent. I will say that, and by the way, this is Donald Trump who wanted to impose a ban on all Muslims coming into the U.S. And so you have Muslim Americans who want to support him. It's illogical and it's irrational. And I think it'll basically fade by the time the election comes around, because faced with those realities, I don't think those people are not going to vote for Joe Biden. So there's a lot of venting right now that's going on.
Jerry and David, this morning there's an article in the New York Times, an article by Thomas Shribman, who I respect a great deal in terms of his views on what's happening internationally. And he says the title of the article is "The GOP Bumper Sticker: Trump First, Putin Second, America Third." it looks like what he's doing, he's scuttling the immigration deal at the southern border, which drags down the support for the Ukraine at the same time. And this is a toxic mix of everything that he's trying to do to scuttle what solutions to the border. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, there's one other element to this, which is that Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel is basically defying Joe Biden's every effort to kind of de-escalate the fight in Gaza. And in doing that, he is trying to help assure that Donald Trump wins re-election. The messier he can make it for Joe Biden, the better the chances are that his friend Donald Trump will win re-election. So you have Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu both not just hoping that Trump beats Biden, but actually making things happen on the ground to make that outcome more likely. It's pretty insidious if you think about it. And by the way, you're right that Donald Trump does not want, this goes back to a point Art made, does not want there to be a deal on the border because that takes away an issue. And so he can stop Republicans in Congress from letting anything productive happen about the crisis that Republicans in Congress insisted a couple of months ago required urgent and immediate action. So now they're going to delay a year because Donald Trump doesn't want him to do anything. That's the question there is, can Democrats make Americans see the cynicism involved there? Broader question is, why didn't the Biden administration do more to stop the problem in the border 2 years ago when they had the opportunity and there was still time? That was it. I think if he loses the election, we'll go back and look at what happened and say that was the fatal mistake, not acting on the border earlier.
Is abortion? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Is abortion still going to be a local issue that can mobilize voters and make a difference in some states?
It might make a difference in Art's state, although Art's state is pretty solidly for Trump. What do you think, Art?
Again, abortion is politically is nuanced because if you put it to a referendum, pro-choice wins, Iowa included, I would say, if Kansas be our guide. Where in Kansas, a very conservative state, voters voted in favor of the pro-choice position in a state constitutional issue. I think the same would be true in most places. It changes when you're voting for a member of Congress or a state legislator who you like their views on, you like their views on transportation issues and everything else, but they disagree with you on abortion. And so you vote for them despite the fact that you disagree on abortion. And so I don't think it's going to be as big of an issue electorally as Democrats might hope it will be, especially in congressional races, and more importantly, in state house races, where the abortion issue is actually decided.
I would have thought that the women of America would rise up and make sure that their daughters have a choice in life, but it doesn't appear that it's going to be a wave of support for politicians who are pro-choice.
Well, it could be, but it could be a wave. But like I said, if it's in the presidential election, I don't think it's an issue. That it's not that big of an issue that motivating voters, in my opinion, from what I know, and because it's being decided at the state level now because Roe versus Wade was struck down. Roe versus Wade was the standard that the Supreme Court held to in 1972 ruling that was overturned and essentially sent all lawmaking back to the states. And so that's where the battles are occurring, and that's why there's so much emphasis now on state house races.
And when there's a referendum, pro-choice wins. But if it's a
Yeah,
state
as it did in
election,
Ohio, but I don't know that it's going to help any candidate, any congressional candidate in Ohio. I doubt it.
Just before we move on here, I just want to go back to just the question of the border. Okay, for you, Art, you know, you have perspectives on people's views about open border and that sort of thing. Just you mentioned the other day when we were speaking that there's the meatpacking plants of Iowa are employ their employees are 90% you know, from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and all of that. Maybe you could speak to that about the differing pressures in places like Iowa that were so dependent upon these migrant workers.
Well, yeah, okay, Storm Lake is a town of about 15,000 people. We're not sure how many people actually live here because so many are undocumented and don't participate in the census. So we believe that we're anywhere from 30 to 50% undercounted. But 90% of our elementary school are children of immigrants, and immigrants populate the meatpacking plants where they're paid about $21 an hour. We have a huge Tyson pork facility here and a Tyson turkey slaughter facility here. We kill 15,000 hogs a day in Storm Lake. 15,000 hogs a day. And it's a very potent issue because the unions were busted by Reagan in the 80s, which brought in a wave of refugees from the Vietnam War who took those jobs and drove out white boys who were raised on the farms. And there was a lot of resentment over that. And then there weren't enough people from Laos to fill the meatpacking plants. So people from Mexico came in. There was another wave of resentment. So it's a non-union workforce. They're easily exploited as they were during the pandemic when they were ordered into patently dangerous workplaces. And
these operations wouldn't function without them.
No, and so fast forward, Ron DeSantis is at a pork feed in Sioux County, deep red Dutch Reform country, and is bitching about immigrants and how we have to deport them all. Well, who the hell do you think cut your pork chop, Ron? And who do you think is working in these dairy barns all around? And those people are in Sioux County voted 77% for Trump, you know, if not higher than that. And so there's obviously a disconnect. The people in those dairy barns that these hardcore Republican MAGA people are voting for are undocumented, and everybody knows it. And they're pretending like they're legal, and we all know they're not. Half the people in Storm Lake probably are undocumented. And it's not a problem. We need more of them. If they'd quit busing them to Chicago and New York and Denver, we could use the help, you know? And so it's all just so cynical, and it's really a non-issue. Now, Jerry said we made a big mistake 2 years ago, you know, by failing to do something about the border. But on the one hand, we're begging people to come in from Guatemala, El Salvador, Venezuela, Cuba, and they work their asses off to get a shot at freedom. And they lay low because they don't want to get arrested and deported. And so I fail to see what the problem is. The problem is, in my opinion, is income, not immigrants. And, you know, we busted what the hell did we expect when we busted the union and told the farm boys to get lost? Who
Yes.
would, by the way, if the CPI had been imposed, they'd be making 125 grand a year today. And when in fact, the average meat packer's making around 40 to 42,000 a year.
Yeah.
So
See,
if we had maintained the CPI for the rest of the classes that they enjoyed, those meat packers would be making 100 grand a year today, and they're not.
yeah,
They got
that's-
the shaft.
yeah. I mean, the income inequality component here that you're referring to is really wrapped into all this resentment and grievance, and it's
Absolutely.
not just immigration. And I was thinking about this the other day that the greatest failure of the American political system in the last 30 years is the failure to fix the immigration system so that we have a system that is sane, that brings in more workers from abroad, more immigrants who are needed in the economy, both in high tech and skilled jobs and in unskilled jobs, while dealing with the border control problem. I mean, it's the system has utterly failed to fix itself to produce a sane outcome for 30 years, and both parties are to blame.
Sorry to preach, but when somebody is willing to crawl across the Sonoran Desert to get to Storm Lake, Iowa, that's the kind of guy I want to meet and work
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
Well,
And
the
so
Republicans used to
that's
say that.
that's why I'm preaching, but it just mystifies me that we've forgotten. My God, you wouldn't want Chinese immigrants coming in because they might build a railroad.
You know, that's what the Republicans used to say. Jack used to say all the time that, open these borders because these are the best Americans and the ones who are coming over the border. And besides, they're family oriented and they'll vote Republican. And that's all been lost.
And
Remember that, Jim?
Ronald Reagan said in the last 2 years of his presidency, I am in favor of amnesty for people who came here illegally because they're working in this country. Ronald Reagan said that. Imagine a Republican saying that today. It's inconceivable.
John Kennedy wrote a book about this.
Yeah.
So it brings up to the economy, which was a major concern issue last fall. But today the economy is on the right track. Inflation subsiding. Your economic growth is slow, but there's no recession. Great job creation last month. But 60%, 2/3 of Americans say it's on the wrong track. How do you explain that? How
You can explain it by
large
going
cities versus urban? Yeah, David.
You can explain it by going to the grocery store. Well, 2 days ago, I went to buy some celery and it was $5. Okay, that celery should have been $1.25. And every single item, and I'm not hitting the farmer here, Art. I'm hitting the grocery stores. Every single item is way out of price, way out of range, and I think we used to say if you look at what the gas prices were as you drove around town, that was a factor, but now gas is way down. Grocery prices are really, really high.
And let me clue you, it's not going to get any better with climate change.
Right.
And if you wonder why egg prices are so high, twice in the last 10 years, the local egg factory here has been hit by avian flu, which you can argue is related to climate change by changing waterfowl migration patterns. And that place has been wiped out. They've suffocated 5 million birds and incinerated them twice over the last 10 years. And so if you think that food prices are going to go down under this consolidated brittle production system, you're wrong.
So a question for you, Art, because when we talked last week, we're talking about election issues and border immigration, abortion, foreign policy, environment, which is number one concern from major people in the world, but doesn't seem to be a major concern as a primary force in the vote of American voters, even though it's a catastrophe. And the water, you would maybe give an example, there's no more water in the Midwest, basically.
Well, yeah, to expand on my soapbox remarks, there is a food resiliency security crisis going on right now, and very few people acknowledge it. And the Ogallala Aquifer covers most of the Great Plains running from South Dakota down to the Texas Panhandle. And about 40% of the nation's beef herd is watered by the Ogallala Aquifer, and it'll be drunk dry within the decade. Similarly, Storm Lake, where I live, is a major protein production center, and it's been in a drought for the last 5 years. The Great Plains have been in a drought for the last 20 to 30 years. And climate experts believe that it could last another 50 years. It's a new millennial drought, and it's already radically changing food production and distribution in the United States as the livestock herds move north in search of water and more temperate climates. Right now, you can't even grow corn in Kansas with irrigation. And so that production is necessarily going to move to Saskatchewan, the upper Midwest of the United States, Alberta. But the problem is that the soils in those areas are not as rich as they are in or were in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Kansas. And we're going to see in the next 30 years up to a 50% decline in corn yields in Iowa, according to leading agronomists at Iowa State University.
So why is that? And
it will
that's
be difficult to grow corn in Iowa in 25 years because of heat that occurs in July during the pollination period. Now, put your head around that. A 50% reduction in corn yields in the tall corn state.
it's
In the
flabbergasting.
next
when
20
you look at
years.
it. But so, Art, when you're looking at that, why doesn't it trickle up as a major electoral issue? It's because too complex goes for
Because the only
for a
issue in the
populist
Iowa
thing.
caucuses was ethanol. That was the only ag issue that was brought up during the Iowa caucuses, either this time or last time, and then they move on to the border issue. And then they say, we're all for ethanol. Well, it takes 3 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of ethanol. And right where I live, we're running out of water underneath this huge ethanol pork turkey complex. And it's running dry. The Jordan Aquifer that covers most of Iowa is down by 40%. There's just starting to, I saw coverage in the New York Times last week of a map of all the aquifers that are going down across the country. And it's damn frightening. And if you appreciate where it's coming from, but as long as Tyson has some water to draw down yet, it's not a problem. It's just when the well runs dry, then it becomes a problem. And that is, our short-sightedness as descendants of apes.
And it's
Okay,
the problem not only in Ottawa, but all of the West and all of the West. Jerry and David, can that become one electoral issue, or there's not one party that has something which is populist that has a solution, I suppose?
I don't know, I'm not sure. The Democrats are deeply concerned about climate change, as we know, but they're not particularly willing to say much about it because it's so alienating an issue to a lot of people on the right who might otherwise be repelled by Donald Trump. I think all of Art's warnings are going unheeded. That's kind of the equivalent of nobody paying any attention to Hitler. It's that kind of threat. So the Democrats have passed some legislation, green legislation that they're quite proud of, but when's the last time, Jerry, we ever heard about them crowing about that? They're being very quiet about that, so as not to attract criticism from the right.
Yeah, I mean, I think people see climate change as a legitimate problem, but a 25-year problem. And they see the $5 stalk of celery that David referred to as today's problem. And Donald Trump shows up and says, well, that's way too much. You're getting screwed. And by the way, if you have a climate change agenda, the truck that delivers the celery to the store is going to have to turn electric, and it's going to cost more, and it's going to drive up the cost of what you have already. And it's already too high, isn't it? So let's not think about the climate change thing. We got other problems. And by the way, you know, the people on the left want to tell you what kind of car to buy, and they're taking away your freedom by telling you you have to have an electric car. So that's not right.
They're the same people who want to tell you can't cook with gas anymore.
Yeah, exactly. But that's why I don't think it amounts. Look, under the Biden administration, American oil production has reached the highest level ever, and we're now the biggest oil producer in the world, and probably the biggest oil exporter in the world too, in terms of LNG. Nobody in the Biden administration wants to talk about it. They, in fact, want to deny it because the left wing of the party doesn't want to hear that. They think that's a betrayal of the climate change agenda. So,
and given what Jerry just said, which is an astonishing fact, the Republican candidate for president stands up there in New Hampshire and says, "Drill, baby, drill."
yeah, and the first thing that I'm going to do when I get into office is start America drilling for oil again. Well, I mean, like, does anybody in the audience know that American oil producers are producing more oil now than they ever have in history, and more than Saudi Arabia is? No, I mean, I guess not. I don't know. How can you explain this?
I'm going to move on here. I'm going to get back to the question here of Trump and democracy and all that, you know.
But before you do, Tom,
Yeah.
let's just agree. Nothing we're going to try to explain today makes any sense.
Okay, but I got to ask the question anyway. Why are so many Americans seemingly ignoring the ongoing apparent collapse of democratic institutions in the U.S. led by Trump? The collapse of democracy and that sort of thing. It's astonishing for people up here to see this.
Well, because they think that those institutions have put them in the boat they're in, and the boat is leaking. And as I said, a meat packer would have been making twice as much 40 years ago as they are today. Who did that to them? The courts, the Democrats, the Republicans. Trump just wants to flip them all the bird, and everybody loves it. I'm gonna tear down the system. I'm gonna burn it down. I am your retribution. And people who've been screwed over for the last half century saying, "Bring it on." And
Okay,
that
I think
explains
you've
it all.
summarized it. I think you've just explained a lot, Art. Really, you know.
And you know, Canada is not immune to that. As our friends in Alberta and elsewhere will tell you, and as the people in the Conservative Party will tell you, Canada is not immune to that argument. Not maybe today, but maybe tomorrow.
David, you teach at McGill. What is the impact of all that's going on in the United States and the campaign and the elections for Canadians?
Well, first of all, we have to talk about whether you can say that in English or French. But en anglais, we say that this is a situation much like 1892 and 1896, where there's a legitimate populist rebellion against a legitimately rigged system, and the political system is reacting to that. And that's, I think, the long and the short of it. And I don't think that's incongruous with what Art's saying or what Jerry said.
I'm not sure I understand everything you're saying.
Pardon me?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're saying.
Well, that there's a populist rebellion going on, much like there was in 1892, when the Populist Party ran J.B. Weaver for president. You probably voted for him, Art.
I did. William Jennings Bryan. He's my kind of guy.
Well, that was 4 years later. Okay.
Goddamn cross of gold anyway.
Right. That was a legitimate movement of people who felt they were being screwed over, and there was ample reason for them to feel that way. And I think we're in another incarnation of that. It took 130 years to get there again, but we're in another incarnation of that. And really, it's a warning to the rest of the system that they had better address this. They better address the sentiment that a certain amount of people are being punished by the system, and that people in flyover country are being ignored, and people in rural America are being ignored. And I remember when a bunch of impatient urban reporters used to say to Bob Dole, "Why are we talking so much about the farm bill?" And he used to say, "You like to eat, don't you?" And so I think we're facing all of those things all at once.
Well, and it's not, and Art should speak to this, but David, it's not just ignored by the elites.
Punished by.
Well, and being ridiculed by, condescended to, like, well, you people are too stupid to understand how good the economy really is. That's one of the problems that I think Biden faces right now. And if your income has gone X amount up X amount in the last 20 years, but some guy who works on Wall Street has gone up 10X times in the last 20 years, you kind of feel that. And if you got kids who are in their 20s who want to buy a house in their 20s the same way you bought a house and your grandparents bought a house in their 20s and they can't do it right now, that's a problem. And it transcends politics, and it explains the appeal of Donald Trump, who doesn't have to tell you how he's going to solve the problem. He just validates your concern and your anger over the existence of the problem.
And let's remember that a generation and a half ago, the people who thought that Wall Street were the culprits were the Democrats, not the Republicans.
So as Canadians, we're watching all this, and but the economy is strong. The economy is going well. And there's much less income inequality in Canada, though we're not immune to some popular things. And you're totally right, David, what's going on in the next federal elections, which is not our subject here. What's more concerning probably is the international position and the consequences for that as a Democrat and member of the free world. And no, we haven't talked about China at this point in time, which is under the radar. It's very important. Is Taiwan, Chinese are going to be intelligent enough not to do anything for the next 12 months. And Taiwan is that a red line, or is that going to crumble like Ukraine is crumbling to Russia? Part of Ukraine. Ukraine is standing up quite a bit. But
well, look, I think Taiwan is and has been a red line. Whether it remains a red line, I think is now open to question. Joe Biden said we'll defend Taiwan if it's attacked by China, even though that's not really America's policy. That's what he said. I can't imagine Donald Trump would say such a thing. There's a strange thing going on in which everybody recognizes China as not only America's chief competitor, but its chief rival, and something approaching an actual enemy at this point. And it scares people. And they want to do something about it. But a lot of what they want to do is basically try to wall China in with sanctions and then retreat and not have to confront it. And that's not probably a winning proposition. But I do think the demonization of China across the board in both parties is almost complete right now, and it can become dangerous.
Jerry, can I ask you a question? If I can't imagine that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan during a Trump second term wouldn't make Trump feel that he had, first of all, he's anti-China, anti-mainland China anyhow, wouldn't provoke Trump. I can't imagine that.
Jerry got just cut out here for some reason. You just disconnected with Jerry.
Yeah.
But
We'll come back.
I'd like to point out at this juncture, if I could, that in my own provincial terms, that about 40% of China is America's third best customer behind Mexico. Iowa's third best customer behind Mexico and Canada in terms of trade. And they consume about 40% of our soybean crop and about half of our pork. In fact, about 40% of the pork produced in Iowa is actually owned. Those herds are wholly owned by the Chinese. And so they are one of our best customers that we're kicking around. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense from that perspective to just tell the biggest market in the world to piss off.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a glitch there for a moment. But I heard what you said, David. Look, I think Donald Trump would go to war with China to defend Taiwan if he was defending America's need for semiconductors from Taiwan? And if we don't need their semiconductors, why do we care about Taiwanese democracy? Does Donald Trump care about any democracy anywhere? I don't think so. I mean, this is almost what Ramaswamy said in Iowa. Like, we should defend Taiwan as long as we need the semiconductor chips that are made there. And once we don't need those anymore, we should bug out. And that's kind of where I think the Republican Party is right now. The idea that we'll defend the noble people of Taiwan to save their democracy. I mean, it's just not, I just don't see it. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but that's kind of how it
Let's
feels.
remember that, again, 2 generations ago and the last generation, defending Taiwan and defending places like Ukraine were the centerpiece of Republican foreign policy ideology, the captive nations, etc. In Europe, Taiwan, we recognize Taiwan and not Beijing. I mean, that is part of the huge change that that Trump has both fomented and reflected.
Speaking, guys, speaking on the question of Ukraine, is there no price for the Republicans to pay in allowing Trump to scuttle this congressional agreement on addressing the southern border problem, which also provides for funding for Ukraine? Is there no price for the Republicans to pay in listening to Trump as all of this gets scuttled?
Well, part of the answer to that question depends on how skillful Democrats turn out to be in placing the blame for the fact that there's no solution on the border and maybe potentially no help for the Ukrainians as they slowly sink into the mud in the east. Can they make sure Americans blame Trump and the Republicans for that, not the Democrats for that? I mean, that's because that may be the reality. So I think you raise a good question. I think there isn't really an answer yet because the Democrats have not proven very adept at framing this the right way. It also may be that in the end, the border deal may get frozen, and even the dysfunctional Congress will figure out a way to send some money to Ukraine before we get to the end of the summer. Anyway, I think that's a possibility. Okay. So I think it's an open question, Tom.
All right, we're into a period now. I think I have a couple of questions from people in the audience, and we can go to that, and discussion can continue where we have another 20-25 minutes that we've told people are going to be on. Question here is, why is the Biden campaign writing off traditional red states while it could at least help Democrats down ballot win their races, especially Senate races like in Texas and Florida? Why are the writing off traditional red states?
Because they don't understand it. Okay. Plain and simple, they just don't get it. And they think that we Iowans are just a bunch of racist hicks, forgetting that we voted twice for Barack Obama. And they just don't get rural America. And so there's a reason people are turning away from the Democratic Party in these places, because they'll just never wake up to it.
It's already a divided country. It's just amazing to me. I'm an American, but I've lived up in Canada, so I view things from a certain distance. But at the same time, I understand. I grew up in Kansas. But I mean, just the differences in viewpoints about the world and about America are just so different.
But if you talk to a Kansas beef producer, they are as concerned about the weather as I am. And they're fully cognizant of what's going on. And they don't have any confidence that the system writ large is there to help them.
All right.
I would just add as a footnote that the American electoral system extenuates this divide. I mean, the presidential election will be decided in 8 states, not 50 states. Everybody knows that. So you consign the blue states to the Democrats and the red states to the Republicans. The presidential candidates never have to talk to people in those states because they're considered to be outside the group of Americans that will determine the next president. And as a consequence, you don't have a conversation that includes everybody. You have a conversation to one side or the other, except in 8 states, where a huge amount of money is spent mostly on negative advertising, convincing everybody that everybody's corrupt and broken. So, this polarization and this division and the tendency to ignore people in certain states that Art refers to is kind of baked into our electoral system, because it's not a national vote that decides who's going to be president. It is the vote by majority in 50 separate states, and it produces this bizarre situation that we're in.
Another question here is, why do Democrats not have a rising star, and why they must go with Biden and nobody else? Is there any rising star that could come?
Well, there are rising stars in the Democratic Party, just as Barack Obama, who was unknown to all Americans except those who were at the Democratic convention in 2003, was a rising star, and no one recognized it. There's a rising star in Michigan, for example, a very, very, very potent star, I would think, Gretchen Whitmer, and there are other stars around, but they're being eclipsed by the big sun right now, Biden.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer is a potential star. Roy Cooper in North Carolina is a potential star. I think Jared Polis in Colorado, moderate Democrat, is a potential star. Pete Buttigieg was a very real political talent, the transportation secretary. But the reality is, in the American system, when an incumbent president says, "I'm running for re-election," people step back, they stand out of the way. And the last person who didn't do that was Pat Buchanan against George H.W. Bush in 1992, and he probably cost him his re-election. And Ted Kennedy did the same thing to Jimmy Carter in 1980 and probably cost him re-election. So no Democrat wants to be the one who stands up, challenges an incumbent president, undercuts him, fails to get the nomination anyway, and then is responsible for his or her party losing the general election. So I don't, Biden should, you could make a strong case, Biden should have stepped back and let somebody else do this. He didn't do that, and that's what you're left with.
I got a question, Tom, here. As Canadians, basically, so we're looking at just going around. We have one major economic issue, which is very stable, which is free trade with the United States and NAFTA. Any worries about? Of course, nobody talks about Canada and U.S. politics. Which is normal in a sense, even though we're the largest partner. You hear any worries on that, or just working well, basically, and everybody's happy and will not go through that process, which was very traumatizing, even for a lot of governors and most of the business community.
I think the Trump threat across the board tariff barriers affects Canada. So I think that in some ways that might obviate the new NAFTA. I think should be a cause of concern across the border.
Although Trump was sort of an architect of the new NAFTA, so he might not want to blow it up.
But that was then, and this is now.
Yeah, right.
Okay, there's something that just came through that the DC Appeals Court just ruled that there's no immunity for Donald Trump for his time as president. Maybe you can comment on what that's going to lead to. What that could lead to. It just happened today. Any comments on whether the Supreme Court will take up his appeal for this ruling on the appeals court, which leaves it would leave it open to the trial to go ahead on his election interference.
Yeah, well, there are two things. There are two things happening multiple things happening, but two things in particular. The Supreme Court today is going to hear arguments about a separate issue, which is whether Donald Trump should be taken off the ballot because he supported an insurrection against the United States, which violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I think it's very unlikely the Supreme Court will say, yeah, Donald Trump should be struck from the ballot. So there's that. The ruling today on immunity will, I think, inevitably also make it to the Supreme Court. And I think that's a very much trickier one for Trump. I find it hard to believe the Supreme Court will say a president or a former president is immune from prosecution no matter what he or she has done. And so If that's the case, the question is, how fast does the Supreme Court decide that? And does that leave enough time for the Jack Smith, the special prosecutor who's attempting to prosecute Donald Trump for January 6th related crimes, has time to actually do so before the election? So I think you've got multiple issues in train here, and the key, I think, in political terms, is the speed at which they reach resolution, because Donald Trump's strategy, his lawyer strategy, is and always has been to just delay.
Okay. Well, the way I understood it, that if this appeals court decision was such that it came out today, it would leave the door open for the trial to go ahead.
That's right, it does, for sure. But the question is, at what time, at what point in the next 6 to 9 months?
All right.
And they could still send this to the full Court of Appeals. This was a three-judge panel, and they could send it to the full panel, which is going to take even longer before you appeal to the Supreme Court. And there could be it could also get sent back to the district court. To Jerry's point, the Trump lawyers, the one thing they're good at is dragging things out. And that's their whole strategy.
Right, exactly.
I've just got a question here that's waiting for other questions to come from the audience here. Is could Biden's support for Israel cost him the election, Jerry?
Could, yes. I don't think it probably will, but it could. I mean, again, we're in a system and a time which everything is decided in the margins. It's basically a 50-50 country and a bunch of 50-50 swing states. And the defection of some Arab American voters in Michigan in particular could tip Michigan. And then if you tip Michigan, you could tip the whole electoral college, and that could cost Biden the re-election. So the answer is yes, but we'll go back to the conversation that David and I had, which is that we're talking in February. By November, this won't be an abstract idea of people. It'll be a choice. As angry as we are as Arab Americans, let's say, with Joe Biden's support of Israel, do we really think opening the door for Donald Trump, who would be much more of the same, is the solution to our problem? If it's presented in that context, in an abstract way, it goes away and becomes real, I think the outcome will be different. So I guess a very long-winded way of saying it could happen. I think in the end, most of those people come back home to the Democrats, but that's not a certainty at all.
Just moving away a little bit from partisan politics and the role of the United States in one of the biggest problems of the world, Israel and Palestine. And you see what's going on, unfortunately, as a window of opportunity for the United States really weighing in and imposing a solution. And
well, that's what the Biden administration will try to do in the next few months. In other words, like I was based in the Middle East for a while. Crisis is opportunity in the Middle East. You have to have a crisis before opportunities are opened up in some cases, and so that's the attitude the Biden administration is going to take. The whole idea that Netanyahu had, which is that you could just wall off the Palestinians and ignore them and they'll somehow magically go away, has been shattered. The idea that the only plausible solution here is a two-state solution where there's a Palestinian state and an Israeli state is going to, when the dust settles here, be revealed again to be the only way out of this mess. We'll move in with some Arab partners and try to create the path in which that becomes closer to a reality. The Saudis will be with us, the Qataris will be with us, and the Israelis will come to recognize that's the real solution to their problem. But that's a long process, and everybody who's tried to get from here to there over the last 70, 80 years comes up short.
Let's all remember Jimmy Carter and Camp David. And that was supposed to be a new reality. It didn't work out so well for Jimmy Carter.
Let's also remember Camp David with Bill Clinton, and it didn't work.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it should have, but it didn't.
Right.
Guys, I think we should wind down now. We have a bit of a technical problem being able to see people's questions. I'm not sure why that's so. but and so I can't read them, and I think we've covered the issues pretty much from the terms of the political scene, what's happening with the economy in the United States and people's reactions to that. And I very much appreciate, in particular, Art, who is new to the group, being able to give some perspectives on what's happening in Middle America.
Yeah.
And he's saying that Saskatchewan is going to be the new breadbasket of North America because nobody has water in the United States anymore.
Duluth and Buffalo are the cities of the future.
There you go. Anyway.
How about some hockey, eh?
There we go. But je m'excuse pour le fait que des questions ne se montrent pas sur l'écran. Mais merci pour votre assistance aujourd'hui. Thanks for tuning into this. We will do this again probably within 3 or 4 months as the political season continues, rolls on. And I want to thank Raymond Bachand for being, such a presence over the last year or so about doing this on a regular basis, and much appreciated. And and I tell the people who are still on here, we will be sending you the recording of this session. Anybody who registered will get access to the recording. And Raymond, if you have another word, any words, go please.
No, it's always a great pleasure to do that. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to David, Jerry, and Art. And next time if the major environmental issue is water, which is the only thing in NAFTA which is out of commerce, there's a clause saying water is not a subject of trade. Maybe that's the 2025 question and pressure from the United States.
OK, tout le monde, merci beaucoup et à bientôt. Au revoir.
Merci.
La prochaine.